I want to introduce our special guests here today, people who have helped us in many ways, and we couldn't have done this project without them. Carol Franklin, if you want to raise your hand, maybe you don't want to, Carol. Yes, there's Carol. Who was my co-author for 10 years, and so we got to be very good friends over that period of time, and I met all of her friends and all of her family, and some of them are here today. Carol is a landscape architect. She taught landscape architecture for many years at the University of Pennsylvania, and many of the photographs that you will see were in our book, and she took them. So we're very grateful to Carol for that, and also for the information in the book. I couldn't have written it without her. There's Bob Meyer. Do you want to raise your hand, Bob, in case people don't know who you are? Bob taught biology here for many years. He was the professor of environmental sciences, and Bob was very generous in giving us a number of maps that he drew himself. You'll see some of those, and photographs, and he worked on this property for decades to try to undo some of the damage that was done some years ago, and we're hoping to pick that up, and that Bob is going to help us to pick that up. And Alex Bartlett is back there. Raise your hand. Alex is with the Conservancy down in Chestnut Hill. It used to be the Chestnut Hill Historical Society. We used to call it the Chestnut Hill Hysterical Society, but we can't do that any longer. And Alex has provided us with a number of photographs and maps and other illustrations that you're going to see here. And I want to thank Alex for his generosity in that.
Well, we need also to acknowledge the IDHE program, Chestnut Hill College, right? And also the Faculty Development Committee. Anyways, and first of all, I want to also say why we started with this project, right? And oftentimes we talk about climate change, environmental issues, warming climate, and it's like a issue that's like distant from our reality. And we want to bring close to our community, and how can we get closer to our community? By working local, right? Like, and as you can see, we have a beautiful watershed. This is the reserve that we have along the creek, right? That's really important to protect our ecosystem services. And on top of that, yes, we give value, but we have a really urbanized area. And the key question here, like, how did we get here, right? Like, because we talk about climate change, we project the future, but it's really important to understand what happened in the past, connect to the present, and then take actions towards the future, right? And that's when this intersection between natural history and human history comes together, right? Like, because for us to understand what happened in the past, to understand the current ecological conditions, you really need to have both of them working together. And ownership and how our mindset, right? Like, used our natural resources is really important to understand how we're going to make the destiny of this land in the future. So that being said, right, like, we, again, worked on these 6 properties. Dave and Carol Franklin compiled during 10 years a lot of great material to understanding the human history aspect, how we utilize the land. And this is a really important resource that we should give value to. And Dave is going to talk a little bit more about how we select these properties. But again, it is really important to put out this material together to engage our community to give more value to these natural resources. That being said, he's going to give a short introduction, and later on, the students are going to talk about each property, right? So, Dave.
I'll make it short because we want to hear from the students. They are the ones who really know what's going on here. The thread that links all these properties is the Wissahickon Creek or the Wissahickon Valley, and each one of them is either on the banks of the Wissahickon or somewhere nearby in the Wissahickon Valley. So that's a kind of a thread or a skein that links all of them together. The paired properties are as follows: Chestnut Hill College campus versus the Morris Arboretum. We didn't set this up as a court case, but we thought that the comparison was very revealing in each case, in each instance. West Chestnut Hill versus the Andorra section of Upper Roxborough, and Erdenheim Farm versus the Andorra Nursery. And in each case, the students are looking at different angles in order to explain why these properties developed as they did, and why some of them were more successful in balancing economic sustainability, that is, being able to be economically profitable or feasible over time, with ecological sustainability. And some of the properties have achieved that more than others. And so that's going to be one of the topics. In examining these properties, they've looked at landforms, that is, the lay of the land, the natural resources that go with the land, and also timing as to when the property was acquired or as to when various changes in the property would take place. Also ownership. In some of these properties, we had either the same group or the same family owning them for a century or more, and that turned out to be very important because the properties weren't going to be sold up and divided off and so forth. The Sisters of St. Joseph, for example, have been here since 1858. The Morris Arboretum's been in existence since 1887. Also, transportation/technology. Those areas that were serviced by railroads had a very different kind of development than those by cars. West Chestnut Hill with the railroad, the Andorra section of Upper Roxborough with Henry Avenue and with automobiles. And then we looked at ideology, sort of broadly defined. The ideology, let's say, of a monastic community, which essentially is what the Sisters of St. Joseph are, as opposed to a Quaker family which owned the Andorra Nursery, and there are different values in both instances. Another ideology that the students are talking about is conservation and the conservation movement in various places. So with no more ado, we'd like our first group to come up here, and they're going to do Chestnut Hill College versus Morris Arboretum, and that's Riley Harker, Valerie Kolchenko, and Nick Ocampo. Please come up.
Oh, it's on. Oh, microphone, yeah. Down, okay. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Like was said, we talked about Chestnut Hill College and the Morris Arboretum. So first, I'm going to talk about kind of the history of the college and the different economic uses that originated here and kind of how it's changed and grown over time. So originally, this location, the earliest economic use, this was a mill pond with 3 different paper mills, and it was created in 1736 by the Deweese family. And then in 1838, it was purchased by Joseph Middleton for his house, and that was the Middleton House, which is still located at the front of the campus at the entrance. It's just now been converted into a different building, and it's part of the sister house. So then, like we already said, in 1858, the Sisters of St. Joseph, they purchased the Middleton House and this small area in line with the monasticism to create this small school in this remote area away from what they referred to as the Wicked City, which was Philadelphia. So this was a remote place for people to send their young girls to go to school so that they weren't close to the city of Philadelphia. So in 1924, it was opened up a little, and there were more small schools created, and then it turned into a college. And then around 1960, the mill pond that was the earliest economic use of this property, it was drained, and the Wissahickon Creek that ran through the property, it was diverted to make space for the influx of students that were coming in. And finally, in 2007, that area where the mill pond once was filled in order to create practice fields as the school shifted to Division II athletics and more student athletes were coming in. So this is a couple images of the mill pond that was used. You see there's people fishing over there and there's people canoeing. So this was, this was an attractive quote-unquote natural resource because it used the natural resource that was the Wissahickon Creek and then the artificial dam that was created to make this place that was a location where people could go just to relax and to hang out and have a good time. And the loss of this resource was kind of a shift away from the environmental sustainability in the sense that they no longer were embracing this the natural creek that created this pond with the dam, and they were looking forward to other ways to enhance the economic sustainability with more students coming in to make space for them. So that's kind of this is more points about what I just said. So when it opened its doors to let more students in, that was boosting the economic sustainability. And then with that, that was when the creek was diverted and the pond was drained and then filled. But some things about the campus that do embrace the natural resources, it's built on Chickee's quartzite, which is a natural occurring resource. And the college itself is built above a floodplain. So where the mill pond and the creek were is actually a complete floodplain. And there's a really good image that Valerie has later that the college is right above that, but obviously the parking lot that is where the floodplain is often floods. But another reason for this flooding and a potential risk in the future is that the creek that was diverted is trying to get back to its original location. So we have a really good map here that was lent to us by Dr. Robert Meyer. So this is a kind of progression. So the first picture, which we'll cycle back to in a second, is before 1999, before Hurricane Floyd. And then you can see the erosion already starting to happen right afterwards. And then in 2005, it's gotten much worse. So the reason this erosion happens is because the creek is not where it originally was, and it's bouncing off of the creek beds. And it's bouncing off of the outside edge of the creek bed towards the inside edge, and that's causing the soil to kind of erode away. And then on the left there is an image people have probably seen a couple times, which is the parking lot flooded. So next, I'm going to talk about the Morris Arboretum. So in 1887, it was purchased by John and Lydia Morris for their summer home. And some people question this decision because the soil and the landscape, it was considered barren and the soil was poor. But John and Lydia Morris, they were Quakers. And like already been said, a big idea of Quakerism was not to spend time on the frivolous fine arts, but to instead focus on things that were happening naturally. So they worked to create what would eventually become the Morris Arboretum, but they wanted to kind of conserve the land, and they embraced the landscape of the Morris Arboretum, which is a hill, and each side of the hill faces the sun at different times, so they can have different species of plant life and kind of show off all those different things. And that's why it's a great place for the Morris Arboretum, because the University of Pennsylvania, when it was gifted to them by the Morrises in 1932, they were able to use it as a place for education and to show people that there are many different species that can survive, and this is different ways we can conserve them and keep them safe, and what we can do just for conservation in general. And like I said, it was a gift that the Morris family gave to the University of Pennsylvania so that it could be used for educational purposes after they were gone. So this is a balanced relationship in the sense that they use the natural resources and their environmental sustainability and the actions they do to promote environmental sustainability to draw people in to learn about things, to get tourists, in a sense, to come to the Morris Arboretum. So this is one example of the wetlands that the Morris Arboretum restored in order to, and they use this as a selling point. So they have this right at the entrance of the property, and they show how beautiful that this natural occurring resource is, and they use it to educate the different species that live in these wetlands, are a teaching point for people who bring their classes and their children in order to show, like, this is what we need to protect. And the Morris Arboretum, with their kind of supporting environmental sustainability and economic sustainability, they also take actions in order to keep, so let me start over. So with this increase in economic sustainability and this income that they're getting, people have to come, and people have to park somewhere if they want people to come. So they develop, This is the road coming into the Morris Arboretum. Sorry, there's the wetlands over there. I don't know how to do the laser, but the wetlands are over there on the left. But here is the technology that they developed. They developed this porous pavement. So this is what is used for the parking lots in the Morris Arboretum, so that there is no water pooling on top of the pavement. It all drains through and can diffuse back into the soil. And Valerie's going to get into that right now, or in a little bit.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how transportation kind of affected both the college campus and the Morris Arboretum. So starting with Chestnut Hill College, the arrival of Chestnut Hill East rail line actually transformed Chestnut Hill from a rural community to a residential suburb in the city. And the Chestnut Hill East line was a rapid form of transportation to reach Philadelphia, and it was established in 1854. Okay. 4 years later, in 1858, the Sisters of St. Joseph's purchased the property that Chestnut Hill College resides on currently, and they had access to the city using the Chestnut Hill East rail line. So in contrast, the Chestnut Hill West line was established in 1884, and it provided the property with even more railway linkage, and it also served as a form of transportation for faculty and students. So the Sisters' property was also connected to the West train station with an electric trolley line in the 1900s, but this was later replaced by a bus line that is run by SEPTA. And before the presence of car culture, most of the faculty and students lived on campus, so there wasn't really a big need to develop parking lots. But after the car culture began to kind of take off, this created a huge demand for parking space within the campus to kind of accommodate for the influx of transportation and automobiles. So, like I said, the car culture forced the construction of parking lots along the floodplain of the property, and this development has been causing a lot of runoff into Wissahickon Creek and a lot of flooding within the campus. And this image here shows the Philadelphia rail system, and in red you see the Chestnut Hill East line, and in blue is the Chestnut Hill West line, and they run practically parallel to each other. Okay, so these two images, so the one on the left shows the floodplain of the campus. As you can see, the parking lots are located directly in the floodplain, and this causes a lot of flooding issues with heavy rain. And then the image on the right is kind of what the area looked like during Hurricane Floyd in 1999, and this is on campus, and it just shows all the different flooding issues that we still face, maybe not as severe, but still a problem. These two images show the creek before it was diverted, as well as before the mill pond was drained. And as you can see, there are no developments of, for example, athletic fields or parking lots in these images so far. These two images show the progressiveness of the parking lot development. So in the image on the left, only a portion of the parking lot had been developed, and the athletic fields hadn't been. So the creek began to be diverted, but not fully. And then on the right, you see the current development of the parking lot spaces as well as the athletic fields, and you can see how the creek had been diverted further down. And so now how transportation affected the Morris Arboretum. So basically, the most direct form of transportation to the Morris Arboretum is by car, and this created an unavoidable need for parking lot development. And so how the Morris Arboretum decided to kind of accommodate for that transportation as well as provide an ecological friendly way of doing so, they installed porous asphalt, which is made without fine particles, and that's how it kind of differs from conventional paving. So porous pavement is considered to be permeable paving, and permeable pavement systems allow rainwater to pass through the paving material, and the water passes through the joints and instead of running across the surface of the pavement. And this runoff then enters an underground stone-filled storage bed where the water can kind of disperse into the ground slowly, and this creates a sustainable stormwater management system along with maintaining transportation accommodation. And this image is just showing the difference after rain between standard asphalt and porous asphalt. As you can see, in standard asphalt, there is water accumulation on the surface, whereas porous asphalt, there is no water accumulation on the surface.
So just to build off what Riley and Valerie said, my part of the presentation is going to focus on the ecological impacts and the different management challenges that the Morris Arboretum as well as Chestnut Hill College does have. So to start with the Morris, it does feature a wide variety of different plant collections and a rare and endangered species. However, there is a big topic to be covered with the whole invasive species. So a lot of ecological systems due to climate change has seen an effect, especially with invasive species, because the problem is that they do take over the native plants and the different greeneries that we do have in the Morris. So research does show that the urbanization has increased temperatures, and it does lead to the timing of flowering and leafing in the certain plant species. But as well as that, so the positive effects that the planting does have for the Morris does get affected by the temperature because it does moderate when you do have to water a plant or when you don't. So drier temperatures tend to kill these plants, as well as wetter environments sometimes leads to overwatering as well. So moving forward, there is a presence of invasive species, and just to give some examples, the Japanese stillgrass and the mile-a-minute weed are things that threaten the biodiversity of the Morris. And there is a big need for the continue of research as well as the conservation efforts to protect the ecological integrity of the Morris Arboretum, similar to similar sites around the Morris as well. So moving forward, there is a big topic to be covered, as well as the maintenance and the management challenges for the external people that do enter the Morris. So they did face a lot of issues that had to be addressed in regards to visitor management, the maintenance of the trails, and the infrastructure. There was a lack of education that the people had when they were visiting the Morris Arboretum, and it did lead to a bunch of challenges that increased the number of visitors and the limited resources that they did have for the site. So in hindsight, they did have a lack of people that were educated entering the Morris, which did lead to the overall education that they needed to have for the visitors. So the way that they did address this issue was to improve the visitor education, as I mentioned, and investing in a staff and volunteer training, as well as partnering with different local organizations to secure additional resources. So the importance of this is the effective management and the collaboration in maintaining the ecological culture values of the public gardens like the Morris Arboretum. And there was a high sense of security, so they did have to integrate different things like the security purposes, even leading to the point where having to pay to enter the Morris to see the different facilities and the different things that they did have as well. So to touch up now on Chestnut Hill College, so Chestnut Hill, just like the Morris, also experienced ecological impacts with very similar reasons to the Morris because of the urbanization, invasive species, and different climate change issues that they did have. So just to touch up, kind of like the Morris, they do have the Japanese knotweed as well as the mortiflora rose that do negatively impact the community here at Chestnut Hill College. And invasive species do have a tendency to smother over the native species that we do have here, limiting the positive effects that those greeneries do have. And just like the Morris, the changes in temperatures do play a huge part in the participation patterns, and they do lead to an alteration in the certain plant species that we do have on campus as well. Just like the Morris, there is a need for research and management efforts to address the ecological impacts that we do have here at our college. And in the last point, I want to touch up on the surrounding community here at CHC that we do have. So as many of us know, the Wissahickon Creek runs throughout campus and dumps into the Schuylkill River. So the two problems that we do have with that is the urbanization and the development in the surrounding areas and the negative impact that it does have on our water quality. So because of our runoff and the pollution that surrounds our urban areas, it does attribute to the negative impacts of our water quality because the runoff does go ahead into the Schuylkill River, which does affect, and like everyone saw throughout the last week, the water quality that we did have on campus. So strategies in order to mitigate this impact are to increase the amount of green infrastructure on campus, which I'll provide a chart in 1 second, but basically to partner with local organizations in order to sustain a development in the surrounding community, to increase greenery, trees, bushes, plants that do affect and collect this pollen and all these negative things that are going into our water system. And the importance of this is to collaborate between academic institutions, not just with Chestnut Hill College, but as well as local communities in order to address the ecological challenges, to face the challenges that we do have here on campus. So thanks to Dr. Robert Meyer, we do have this chart right here. That is a restoration plan in order that does affect with the flooding zones, as well as it correlates with the water quality that we do have. So I just like to go over this. So there is a lot of different address and points that are pointed out through the chart, like new and improved shrubs to add greenery and different plants that are all highlighted through the chart as well. So I'll go ahead, pass it over to you.
You can go sit down. Okay. Our next group is going to look at, let's see, the west side of Chestnut Hill versus Upper Roxborough, and that's Fiona Geckel, Tiffany Palacios, and Chloe Mathieu.
Hello. So, yes, we're going to be talking about the west side of Chestnut Hill versus Upper Roxborough. So, a little bit background on the two areas. The Wissahickon Creek splits the two areas. So the Andorra is on the one side, and then West Chestnut Hill is on the other side. And each of these areas use different land use, and there's different developmental patterns that we're going to be comparing, and also different transportation systems. So the owner, maybe not the original owner, but the owner at the time of all the development was Henry Howard Houston. He had two children, Samuel and Gertrude, who are going to be more important right now. Oh, sorry. So Gertrude married George Woodward, and Gertrude inherited the west side of Chestnut Hill to develop. So when they began the development, they wanted to make sure that a lot of it was preserved, and we still see a lot of the same architecture and buildings today. They still own a bunch of the original properties, and they still have mortgages and stuff on those properties. And they kept the original architecture for over 100 years. They have the Wissahickon Heights, which was later known as St. Martin's, and they're inspired by the Garden City movement, which was the architecture from England. And it was linked by the commuter rail to the area was linked to larger nearby cities. So, in contrast, the Upper Roxborough / Andorra area, Houston tried to develop it himself, but there was an economic depression, and there was a lot of other factors that made it develop the way that it is today. Upon Houston's death, his son, Samuel Houston, was granted the land, and he also tried the development, but all of his developmental endeavors fell through, so he ended up selling his section, and that's why it's different today. So there's like a big Andorra shopping center, and it was heavily influenced by the post-war car culture because there's a lot more roads and stuff like that. We'll see the comparison a little bit later. And it resembles post-war American automobile suburban development. So some of the natural landforms for both of the areas, this is an elevation map. So the darker the red is the higher the elevation, and Chestnut Hill and Andorra both have a lot of hills. It's just a very abundant natural resource throughout both of these areas. And another natural resource is the water resource. So again, the Wissahickon is on either side of, or the Wissahickon splits the Andorra and Chestnut Hill. So the creek is 23 miles long, and it empties into the Schuylkill River like we talked about before. And there's a lot of plant and vegetation around the river, which helps with erosion. And then there's other animals that rely on it as a water resource. And this is another picture. This is specifically for Chestnut Hill, and this is a 2017 study that was done and showcasing the different types of protected land. So the darker green is the publicly owned protected land, and that is mostly the Wissahickon, which is owned by Fairmount Park. And then there's also investments all around the different areas, which just can never be or are not going to be developed for a long time, but there is a lot of protective land in this area, which is very good because that means it was developed the right way. And there's no other map like that for the Andorra. So this is just a comparison. So this is the economic uses, and as you can see, these are two pictures from downtown Chestnut Hill. It's just a very walkable area. People bring their dogs. I see people walking their dogs all the time down the street, and you could walk from your house to the area and not have to rely on any other type of transportation. And then this video is Andorra. And that's focusing on the Andorra Shopping Center. So you have to have a car when you're going to the shopping center. You can't just walk to it, like in Chestnut Hill. And I mean, even Chestnut Hill has their railroads and stuff like that, so. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so George Woodward and Houston's daughter Gertrude developed a neighborhood in the west side of Chestnut Hill, and they built houses and rented them instead of selling them, which created a stable community, so no one could sell them or tear them down. The neighborhood is known as the St. Martin's neighborhood, which was named after the church that they also developed. The neighborhood is located east from the edge of the Wissahickon Park to the railroad station on the Pennsylvania line. Originally, as Fiona said, Henry Houston called this development the Wissahickon Heights. There's attractive landscaping around the houses with the park just below the area, so the park ends up creeping up into the neighborhoods. Woodward also developed the Philadelphia Cricket Club, the golf club behind it, the St. Martin's Church, and a hotel, which ended up being turned into a private school. And as you can see in the photos, the park is uninterrupted by the residential areas. It's the top picture. And then in Upper Roxborough, the housing developments in Henry Avenue in Upper Roxborough formed a wall against the park. You can see there's like a solid row of houses and garages facing the street and almost treeless yards, and most of the trees were invasive. Okay, and then as you can see, the houses in the west side of Chestnut Hill, there's trees, plants, foliage, and vines, and the vegetation around this small house could be seen to embrace the house, unlike the sparse plants around the houses in Upper Roxborough. And in this footage, you can see an estate, and the forest just kind of like creeps up around the estate and the driveway. And then this next drone footage shows Upper Roxborough and Henry Ave. You can see like the rows of houses and just the wall against the park. And there's a lot of like rural land around. And then the rows of houses along Henry Ave. Okay, so next is changing transportation and communication technologies. So first in West Chestnut Hill, it was essential to make a railroad, and the area became a railroad suburb. So the railroad allows the landscape of the community to be undisturbed. As you can see, there's the high railroad bridges to allow the flow of the Gresham Creek to still flow beneath the railroad. The train is easily accessible to people that live in the area, so they can just go downtown. And in Upper Roxborough, a railroad was intended to be created along Bells Mill Road, but this was never done, and the area ended up staying rural for a long period of time and was finally developed post-World War II into an automobile suburb. Henry Ave was built, which is the 4-lane road that we just talked about, and it's built along the park's edge. And with the emergence of car culture and shopping centers, there's the parking lots, and you can see the shopping centers. The creation of the shopping centers changed the landscape, roads, and relationship to the Wissahickon Park. And this image above shows the makeup of the proposed site of the Andorra homes and the shopping centers. And the yellow lines show the extension from Henry Ave to the route of Cathedral Road. And there was a plan to connect the park to the community, but as you can see in the second picture, that was never done.
So now I'm going to be getting into the ideology. I'm going to be getting into the ideology of West Chestnut Hill and the Andorra Shopping Center. So I think the biggest image that I first wanted to bring up that I think really kind of describes the impact that the Wissahickon had on West Chestnut Hill is this image to our top right. It just is an image that was painted, and it's called The Picnic, and it's just a story of the Wissahickon in general. This image was painted in 1844, and it really just showcases how, in general, the Wissahickon, even before it was actually a park and it was designated one in 1868, it really was for recreational purposes. People loved being involved in nature, people loved feeling connected to it, and this image really well depicts that. We see people picnicking, you know, in a canoe, which I know like other areas have also, like the project before us is also depicted. Our image to the top, to the bottom left depicts the Philadelphia Cricket Club, and that was in 1925. I think the biggest thing that kind of, you know, showcases is the fact that on top of being involved in nature, people really like to be connected to one another, and having these shared spaces that everybody can use and is accessible to everybody is really important to us. So in the middle section, we see the Cricket Club, and then to the top left of that image, it just kind of showcases in general residential development that had kind of started to occur during this time. And then the bottom right is the former horse show kind of like grounds. And on top of that, that's another depiction of how people really love to be able to feel connected in some way to nature. In general, Upper Roxborough, I think, although it does have a park, if you have been in the area, I don't have an image of it, it's not as renowned as the Wissahickon in general. On top of that, Upper Roxborough, the Andorra area in general, has put a larger focus on development, urbanization, which I'll show in my later slides. So ecosystem services, I think the biggest thing that we kind of need to realize is between these two areas, there's a lot of differences between the ecosystem services overall. West Chestnut Hill, because of the more vegetation, because of the fact that it has more trees in general, it has better ecosystem services through the Wissahickon Park specifically, just because it is so interconnected with West Chestnut Hill. It has the ability to have more air purification, water purification, and general carbon sequestration that we're able to see. And I think the biggest thing compared to like the presentation earlier than us, there's flood control, luckily, which helps the area overall. And then Upper Roxborough, we see a lot less of these ecosystem services. A big part of it is just due to the urbanization that's kind of occurred. These residences that weren't really well incorporated with the nature within the area that we see in West Chestnut Hill. And I have an image later that's going to show that. But I think that's the biggest thing, is just the lack of integration and for the long-term, overall future. So the image to the right, we see the gradient of wilderness overall. This image is from 1987. The green depicts, and then we see a lot of residential land, which I think is the big thing we're trying to really point out here when it comes to these two differentiating areas. Going off of that, I think the next biggest thing that I think we've all seen, not just in these areas, but in general in our world, is this heat island effect we're facing with climate change. In general, West Chestnut Hill just has a lot less of human activity due to the fact that it doesn't have this like ongoing shopping center with cars constantly, traffic's constantly busting through compared to West Chestnut Hill. In general, there's a lot more vegetation, which I talked about earlier in West Chestnut Hill. And then just kind of going off of that, that kind of gives West Chestnut Hill this upper hand when it comes to this heat island effect that we're seeing. On top of that, as Valerie mentioned earlier, this idea of impervious surfaces is something that we really need to be more aware of. I will say before this project, I was not as aware of it. And now going forward, I think it's something that is definitely going to be, in top of mind. I think impervious surfaces, we see a lot less of them in West Chestnut Hill just due to the fact that since there is the Wissahickon, and on top of that, there is a lot less development going on. In Upper Roxborough, the Sandora area, we see a lot of these apartment complexes where we put these dense populations of people in such a small space, which obviously adds even further to our climate footprint when it comes to that. And in general, these impervious surfaces, when it comes to sidewalks, roads, and buildings overall, cause for these like re-radiation of heat to occur and has that effect. We see it a lot more. This image to the right here, I thought was just a beautiful image that really depicts West Chestnut Hill. When you're walking through or you're driving through that area, you see these two, normally like on both sides whenever you're going, you see a vegetation, these trees, these huge trees, and obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that helps a lot when it comes to this air purification aspect, but in general, it helps with the heat island effect. And this is something that we don't really see when we're going through the Andorra area. Going off of that, I think the next biggest thing that we see is runoff, this flooding impact that we see in general. And in West Chestnut Hill, in general, it just has a lot more open in these natural areas, and the vegetation in general just allows for it to be absorbed and actually filtered through the area, unlike in Upper Roxborough, which, as I mentioned earlier, has these impervious surfaces, which cause for flooding, erosion, which we've seen even here. And then the image to the right, I just thought was a beautiful image of a brick gutter that's actually, it used to be in West Chestnut Hill, and then in 1990, it was actually covered up. But still, in general, in West Chestnut Hill overall, we're able to see a lot more better flood control when it comes to runoff. And then finally, I think the next biggest thing, which we see a lot, after like what we've talked about earlier, the automobile industry in general is obviously very impactful in our world today. Everybody has a car pretty much, and if not a car, there's a lot of people taking public transportation. But in West Chestnut Hill, because of the fact that it has this regional rail station and in general commuter train stations, there's a lot more people that are able to use those, which obviously lessens their carbon footprint than everybody taking their own individual car and driving everywhere. And it's just a lot more of a walkable city. You're able to get from place to place a lot easily without the need of a car in general. And this overall less reliance on cars is just better for our environment. In comparison to Upper Roxborough, there's a lot more car transportation to get to those areas. You have to really have a car. It's not walkable at all, which is not helpful when it comes to carbon emissions. I think the biggest thing is just like the lack of public transportation and the fact that they didn't overall think about not only like what's better for the residents, but also like what's better for the environment. So this image to our right is something that we talked about a little bit earlier in our presentation, which is Henry Ave. To the left of Henry Ave, we see the Wissahickon, this wall that Henry Ave kind of like caused with like the start of urbanization and like development that occurred in this area. And this is just like in general the lower Andorra area. And that's it for us.
At one point, we were thinking we'd ask for questions and answers after each set, but I was afraid that that was going to hold things up. So our third group is going to talk about Erdenheim Farm versus Andorra Nurseries, and they're split up in two different places, and that's Jason Fisher, Grace Welsh, and Christopher Lasco.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. We're going to be talking about Erdenheim Farm and the Andorra Nursery. So I'll be talking about the landforms and natural area for both the Erdenheim Farm and the Andorra Nursery. For the Erdenheim farm, it was well known for their agriculture, and it was also known for being preserved for almost a century. The soil of Erdenheim was rich in limestone, which was good for crops, as those crops were not just fed to cattle, but also horses, which was a big impact in horse racing for Erdenheim farm. For Andorra Nursery, the nursery was not used for agriculture, but mostly for cultivation of plants. Due to the location of the Andorra Nursery, which was an urban area, causes the area to not be suited for cropping. Post-World War II, most of the Andorra land was sold because of the lack of money. As in the left, an aerial picture of Erdenheim Farm. On the top right is a picture of an Andorra Nursery catalog, which was known for, as I said earlier, was cultivation of plants, is one of the species of evergreen. The bottom is a picture of the area of Andorra Nursery. Here's some pictures of for the left is of horse. It was really known for horse racing. And for the right is a recent picture of the horse racetrack.
All right, so I'm going to speak a little bit about the economic uses of Erdenheim Farm. So historically and today, the farm has been used for breeding thoroughbred horses, and they've also raised Angus cattle and sheep. And in the past, the farm was a major producer of grain in the region. It was considered part of the breadbasket of the colonies. And as Christopher said, since there's a limestone bed underneath, it helps to create fertile soil, which makes it a good place to grow wheat. And currently, the current owners, the McCauslands, host an explorer camp, and they greatly subsidize the land themselves. And so that's what makes it economically sustainable, but it wouldn't be possible without their subsidy. And in contrast, Andorra Nursery, the upper section of Andorra Nursery was once farmland, but it was then converted so that it could become part of the nursery. And it was once one of the largest tree and shrub nurseries on the East Coast. It's no longer in business today. And since it went out of business, the main sales office has been converted into Cedars House Cafe. So if you've been on Forbidden Drive, you've seen that. And that's the current use of that building today. And a former house for nursery employees has since been converted into Wissahickon Environmental Center. And so those two buildings are a good example of what's called adaptive reuse, which is where you take old buildings and repurpose them for new purposes. So on the left is an example from Erdenheim Farm. This is the Dixon Meadow House. And so it was originally a farmhouse for farm workers, but it has since been converted to an education center. So once the farm was purchased partially by the White Marsh Foundation, they decided to designate that as an education center. And then in contrast, the Cedars House Cafe, as I said before, was once a nursery headquarters, and has since been converted now to a cafe for people to use. And then some ownership differences. So Erdenheim Farm, the owners held very similar ideas of how to maintain the property. So, like as I said, they've raised the Black Angus cattle and the thoroughbred horses from the beginning. And so when you have owners that have very similar ideas for the economic uses, it really helps to keep things running smoothly as ownership transfers. So George Widener purchased the farm in 1915, and he left it to his nephew, Fitzeugene Dixon, who owned it up until 2006. So since they were part of the same family, this family owned the farm for 91 consecutive years, and that helped to save it from development because they had similar ideas of how to maintain the property. And after Fitzeugene Dixon's death, the McCausland family worked with the White Marsh Foundation to purchase the land and put on conservation easements so that it would be safe from development. And the McCausland family currently continues the agricultural activities on the farm and helps to keep it economically sustainable. In contrast, Andorra Nursery had a couple of different ideas of how the property would be maintained. So Richard Worcester purchased the property with the intent of building an estate, but he never followed through with his plan. And then in 1886, Henry Howard Houston purchased the property and then used it for a tree nursery. And after Henry Howard Houston's death, William W. Harper took out a 99-year lease from Houston's heirs, and he managed the property as a tree and shrub nursery. But after Harper's death, the nursery went out of business due to a lack of staff during and after World War II. So a lot of the staff was away fighting in the war, and so they were having trouble staying economically sustainable. And then once the soldiers came back, the GI Bill and suburbanization caused much of the land to be sold for development. And the nursery made more money selling the property for development than continuing the business. In addition to the land that was lost to development, some of it was also sold to the Fairmount Park Commission. And so now there's parkland that can be enjoyed for the public. And so here are two of the main owners of the properties. On the left is George Stunton Widener Jr. He was the first of the family to own the farm, and he purchased it in 1915 and ran it until his death in 1971. On the right is Henry Howard Houston. We already saw him for the West Chestnut Hill, but he was the owner of Endora Nursery beginning in 1886, and then after his death, the property was leased out. And then here I have a map showing Erdenheim Farm. Is this? Oh, yeah. Okay. So you see on the bottom right is the key for it. So anything inside the red is part of Erdenheim Farm, but it's divided up into different tracts. So the dark green is the Dixon property. So this was in 2000 when Fitzeugene Dixon still owned it. So he owned the sheep tract, the Angus tract, the equestrian tract, and the residence tract. And the rest of it was left to the Natural Lands Trust. And this was prior to the hill at White Marsh being purchased. And then in contrast, in 2023, today, after his death, it's divided much differently. So the McCauslands own the equestrian tract, Wissahickon tract, and the residence tract. And so they maintain agricultural activities in that area, whereas the White Marsh Foundation owns the sheep tract and the Angus tract. And so that's more used for public use, while this is more for agricultural use. And the hill at White Marsh was since built, and the Dixon Meadow House that I showed a picture of earlier is located in the White Marsh Foundation property. And then here are just some pictures showing how it is today. So as I said, the Black Angus cattle and the thoroughbred horses were two main economic sources for Erdenheim Farm, and that's still used today. And on the right is is part of Endora today. This is what's preserved now and is available for public use.
So I'm going to talk about the various ideologies that affected Erdenheim and Endora Nursery. For Erdenheim Farm, it was primarily the love of English tradition, specifically that of creating a country estate, which was when the wealthy elite of society would create a house out in the country in order to escape the heat of the summer in the cities, as well as the crowded populations found there. On these countries' estate, they would take part in popular English pastimes, such as horse racing, fox hunting, and tennis. When Widener Jr. took over the farm in 1915, he decided to restore the largely horse racing farm back to its former glory as a 19th century gentleman's farm. So that's what we see today because it has still been preserved as that idealist 19th century gentleman's farm. In contrast, Endora Nursery suffered severely under the suburbanization pressures following World War II. It lost a lot of its labor force to the war and just really decreased operations following it. So it was easier for them to sell off the land than to keep operations going. The suburbanization pressures mainly come from the idea of wanting to create suburbs so that people could have a life and a house outside of these cities, but would still be close enough that they could get to their jobs there. However, at the same time as these pressures going on, we see a growing consciousness towards conservation and preservation, which allows Andorra Nursery to preserve the original 100 acres for future use as a nature preserve. Okay, so the top two pictures are architecture found at Erdenheim Farm. Today, they're still there. However, they weren't the original designs that the farm had. Widener, largely due to his Anglophile taste, decided to renovate or completely redo the architecture he found at the farm when he first purchased it. Down here, you can see a picture of fox hunting, a popular English pastime that they did partake here in Erdenheim Farm. And then this English landscape is an image of an English farm that was Widener's inspiration for his 19th century gentleman's farm. Okay, yeah. And then this video is of Erdenheim today. You can see that the sprawling grasslands and just fields of nature are really idealistic of what he wanted to create out of his 19th century gentleman's farm. In the background, you can see the hill at White Marsh, so this is more present day. Okay, so then this is Andorra Nursery. This picture is from 1929 when the nurseries were still in operation. As we said earlier, it was one of the largest tree shrubberies on the east coast. So it was very prosperous. However, today you can see that it is largely developed land. And then this is just an image of today, a map of today, where you can see that Erdenheim Farm is over here, and that at its peak, the Andorra Nursery spread across a large expanse of land.
Technology impacts on both areas. For Erdenheim Farm, from 1700 to 1800, agricultural technology started to develop, creating new methods for cropping, such as horse-drawn plows. In 1900, machines such as tractors and automobiles started to develop, which caused horses to be replaced. For Andorra Nursery, steam power machines were created, causing an increasing of lodging, which affected the area. Different methods during the 1900s of transportation started to develop, such as cars, buses, and trains, which brought more tourism, but also was beneficial to transporting on plants. Here in the left is a picture of the land of Andorra Nursery, and on the right is Erdenheim Farm.
So current ecological conditions. Following Fitz-Eugene Dixon's death, Erdenheim Farm was in danger of development by just land developers who wanted to urbanize the farm. However, the White Marsh Foundation and Natural Lands Trust did ensure that the farm remained preserved and in full operation when they asked Peter and Bonnie McCausland to buy the land. The McCauslands were allowed to buy the land after meeting requirements to ensure that they would continue this tradition of preserving the historic farm and prevent it from being developed by urban pressures. The Declaration of Conservation and Open Space, easements, covenants, and restrictions properly defines these terms and restrictions on how the land can be used and prevent it from being developed. That declaration also created the Dixon Meadow Preserve. In contrast, the Andorra Nursery was reduced to its original 100 acres following the suburbanization pressures after World War II. It is known as the Andorra Natural Area now, and it's managed by the Friends of the Wissahickon, the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, and part of the Wissahickon Park because it is today part of the Fairmount Park lands. And part of it has been cleared of invasive species and replanted with native species, specifically in the Andorra Meadow. This is now home to 20 species of birds. Unfortunately, the rest of the former indoor nursery lands are still mixed with the exotic species and native species that were brought in during nursery operations. So this is just a picture of Erdenheim Farm split into the various divisions today. So you can see the sheep track, Angus track, the hill at White Marsh, and just who owns it. This is a picture of Andorra Nursery. It just shows and highlights how small it started out and then grew to this largest nursery on the East Coast, only to then turn into the original 100 acres we see today. And then this is a picture of the Andorra Natural Meadow, where people like to birdwatch and just enjoy nature. I think
So as you can see, right, like it does matter, like again, ownership and ideology over time, right? Like it does matter how we utilize our natural resources, and all the time, right? Like when we try to preserve, gets into conflict with ecological, economic development, and that's this issue that we always try to solve, right? Like, and as you can see, ownership and ideology in time and space, it does matter. And that's basically what you can see from all these different 6 properties. And future direction, we want to continue this project, choosing other properties to look at this rich environmental history that we have in our area, engage the students and our community. We have like a Chestnut Hill Conservancy, Bob, that like collect a lot of this material over the years with previous students, Carol Franklin, Dave, like that spend a lot of time creating this nice environmental history, right? Anyways, that's enough for today. The future directions, yes, we are trying to make this digital material to engage more the students into this real world, like outside. So basically the idea is to bridge this gap between the digital and the real, right? Like, and next semester, David and I, we're going to continue teaching the same course, and the idea is to keep going with this project. Anyways, we have a little bit of time for questions, but thank you for your attention. Maybe all of you can.
Let's applaud the students again. And thanks everyone for coming.